In a world that seems to be building more and more walls, one question keeps coming up. Who gets to belong? It's a huge question, right? And it's one that political philosopher Seyla Benhabib tackles head-on in her incredible book, The Rights of Others. So today, we're going to dive into her big ideas on what it means to have rights in a world of nation-states. Let's get into it. I mean, you've seen it 1,000 times in the news. Someone shows up at a border, running from something terrible or just hoping for a better life. And right there, in that one moment, two massive ideas collide: a nation's sovereign right to control its own borders, and the basic, universal human rights of the person standing right there. So, who wins that fight? For Seyla Benhabib, this isn't just some abstract policy debate. No, she argues this tension is a fundamental paradox, something that's baked right into the DNA of modern democracy itself. It's a puzzle we really can't afford to ignore. So to really get what she's arguing, we first have to wrap our heads around this paradox at the border. What is this conflict she's talking about, really? Okay, here's the core of it. On one hand, any democracy is built on the idea of we the people, right? A specific group of people who decide their own destiny. And that naturally implies they have the right to decide who gets to be a part of that me. But on the other hand, these very same democracies have also signed on to uphold universal human rights, rights that belong to everybody, whether they're a citizen or not. See the problem? Benhabib has this great way of describing it. She calls it a permanent tug of war. You've got the pull of the universal, this belief that all humans have certain rights no matter what. And then you've got the pull of the particular, our loyalty to our own specific communities, our own nations. And that tension, she says, isn't going anywhere. And as you can imagine, this paradox has fueled a huge, ongoing debate among political thinkers. So let's take a look at the two main camps in this great debate. So on one side, you have what you could call the nation-first camp. Here you've got thinkers like Michael Walzer, who really worry that all this globalization is just watering down what it means to be a citizen. For them, protecting a nation's unique culture and identity means you have to control your borders. Then on the other side, you've got the humanity-first view. This comes from a tradition inspired by philosophers like Immanuel Kant, and it basically says our number one moral duty is to all human beings, period. Nationality just doesn't matter as much as our shared humanity. So where does Benhabib fit into all this? Does she pick a side? Well, this is where it gets really interesting. She doesn't. Instead, she charts her own course. In her fantastic, award-winning book, Benhabib basically carves out a middle path. She says we don't actually have to choose between a nation's sovereignty and universal human rights. There are ways, she argues, to honor both. Her first big idea is something she calls porous borders. Now listen closely, this is not the same as open borders. Benhabib is clear that states do have the right to regulate who comes in. But, and this is the game changer, once someone is admitted, there has to be a real path for them to become a full member of society. You can't just have a permanent class of aliens. That's not on the table. And that idea leads directly to her second key concept, just membership. This is where Benhabib makes a really bold claim. She says that the right to belong to a political community is actually a fundamental human right in itself. It's not just some privilege that a state can decide to give or take away. And to back this up, she draws on some of the biggest names in political philosophy. She looks back to the 18th century philosopher Immanuel Kant. Kant talked about a right of universal hospitality, a pretty radical idea for his time, basically saying we have a moral duty not to treat foreigners as enemies. But Benhabib argues Kant didn't take it far enough. See, his idea was more about a temporary right to visit, a right to sojourn, as he put it, without getting hurt. It left out the really crucial next step. What about the right to stay? The right to actually put down roots and become a part of the place? That's the gap she wants to fill. Another huge influence is Hannah Arendt. After seeing the absolute horror of what happened to stateless people in 20th century Europe, Arendt wrote about what she called the most basic right of all, the right to have rights. In other words, the right to belong to a community that will actually guarantee your other rights, like freedom of speech or safety. Now, for Arendt, that right was pretty tied to being a citizen of a specific nation. But Benhabib says, in our interconnected world, that's just not enough anymore. She argues that the right to have rights has to be separated from nationality. It needs to be a truly universal principle that protects everyone, everywhere, no matter what passport they hold. Okay, so this all sounds great in theory, right? porous borders, just membership. But how on earth would this actually work in the real world? Benhabib has an answer for that. It's a process she calls democratic iterations. Let's break down what she means by that. So, a democratic iteration is basically a big society-wide conversation. It kicks off when an existing rule or law gets challenged, maybe by a group that feels their rights are being ignored. That challenge sparks public arguments, debates, you name it. And then through all that back and forth, the community ends up rethinking and reinterpreting its own rules, literally becoming, as she says, both the subject and the author of its laws. A perfect real-world example she gives is the big headscarf debate in France. A law was passed banning religious symbols in public schools. Right away, it was challenged by Muslim students. And this didn't just stay in some courtroom. It exploded into a massive public conversation all across France about what it means to be French, what secularism is, and who truly belongs. That whole process, the challenge, the debate, the rethinking, that is a democratic iteration in action. It's how a healthy democracy learns and grows. Now, of course, Benhabib's work isn't the final word on the matter. Her ideas are part of a much bigger, ongoing conversation, and they have definitely faced some tough and fair questions. Critics jump in with some really important points. They ask, who actually gets to participate in this big conversation if the people it's about, the non-members, are already on the outside looking in? And can a public debate, no matter how robust, really overcome something as powerful as deep-seated nationalism? These are the serious challenges her theory has to grapple with. But even with these critiques, what Benhabib has done is just so important. She pushes us beyond the simple dead-end debate of just open borders versus closed borders. She forces us to get back to basics and think about the actual moral foundations of our political communities. She gives us a much smarter, more nuanced way to talk about what we owe each other in this crazy globalized world. And that really brings us back to where we started. In a world where it feels like new walls are going up every day, Seyla Benhabib's work leaves us with a powerful challenge and a question we all have to answer. What does it really mean for every single human being to have a right to have rights?